Hopefully everyone can hear me. That's be a good first start. Excellent, good, excellent. Thank you very much. Always good to start with that. So a bit of exchange with Sarah, and we had a kind of open niche topic about electric vehicles and some of the concerns. Now, Sarah, if you could let me do screen sharing, Sarah, that'd be useful, because I've put together some slides just so I thought it'd be useful just to kind of structure the conversation.
Okay.
Just the easy way. That should be good now. It says I should. Nope, still disabled.
Oh, hang on. I remember doing this last time, and somebody had to tell me how to do it.
You have to make him the host.
Sorry?
You make him the host, and then he can able to do that.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Hang on. Sorry, I'm almost there.
No problem.
I feel like I'm possibly not the best person to be in charge of hosting meetings. How do I make him the host?
Participants. Which one?
Damien. He's.
Just go to the little 3 dots next to him.
Go to the little 3 dots.
No, I've lost him.
Next screen.
I'm still here, honestly.
Oh, there you are. Okay. Make host. Okay. Okay, I think I've done it.
You are a host now. Yes, I believe I am. Oh, there we go. See, now we're in business. Cool. I'll stop that for a second. And I haven't quite prepared as well as I should either. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see a discussion on electric vehicles, Damien Scully. Does everyone see that? Oh, good.
We can. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. So, as I said, there's kind of an open, kind of brief when this kind of came up as something that we should try doing. So what I tried to come up with, now I guess, if you don't know, my Damien Scully, I've worked in and around the automotive industry for about the last 30 years. Mostly all on sales, kind of sales and marketing, consulting and training side of the business. So I'm not an engineer, I'm not a chemist, I'm not any of those kind of deep technical clever things, but I do a lot of work with the industry and around electric vehicles. And I guess I describe myself as an EV advocate, but maybe not an evangelist. And that, I recognize there's some issues that need in consideration that needs to be thought through quite carefully. So what I'd like to cover, and hopefully it's kind of addresses some of the thoughts, but I'm happy to talk about other things as well. If I know the answers, we'll see how that goes, was stuff about batteries. So the classic sort of where do batteries come from, and at the end of their life, where do batteries go and what may happen to them. A little look at the whole concept of embedded carbon, which is one of the areas that's comes up as controversy quite often. And then the other thing, if you hang out any amount of time on kind of EV forums or EV Twitter or whatever, is the kind of condemnation of plug-in hybrids as the incarnation of evil. And I thought it was interesting to kind of maybe have a discussion about that, and see where they sit. I guess that was there. So that's what I'm proposing to chat with. I've got a couple of some slides for each of them. I'm happy to take questions, but what I have done is put a kind of a pause in at the end of each block so we can have a discussion. So, but if you've got something you really want to raise as we go, if you want to use the raise hand function, and hopefully either myself or Sarah will see it and they can stop me. I may miss it. It's why it's sometimes easier to have a definite pause. So hopefully that's more or less what people were expecting. And if that's okay, I will press on and start talking about batteries, if that's okay with everyone. And I'm fine for put my, there's my glass of water, I couldn't see. Okay, so tables about battery concerns that comes up is issue about where the key raw materials come from. So one of the two biggest components of lithium-ion batteries is lithium, hence the name. Now lithium is relatively plentiful. There's quite a lot of it, and in fact, as we as we're looking for it, we seem to keep finding more of it. They've recently found there's potential for a lithium mine in Cornwall. So I know Martin will be particularly pleased with that idea. But it's kind of interesting in that, obviously it creates in somewhere like Cornwall, which is in a UK sense, at least a relatively deprived area, this idea that someone can say, well, actually that would provide unemployment, that would provide employment and, non-seasonal work and all those things. So that's, there's quite a lot of it. The main, it is an extractive process though. There's two ways of doing it. There is literally, as you can see there, there's mining, in the sense of a bit like open cast mining as they often do in Australia. But that's the same in China, in Portugal. If we were to extract it in Britain, it would also be a mining process. And then there's also in South America, they do a lot of lithium extraction there, which is done by pumping water underground, which then brings the lithium up, and they then evaporate it in solar ponds. They create artificial lakes of what becomes lithium. And as I understand it, there's a kind of, you get a slurry, you move that, you do something else to it, you re-evaporate it. It's a reasonably lengthy process. And Pat, I was reading a thing in preparation to this, was saying that if you set out and you were funding a lithium extraction, it's significantly quicker to build a mine like they have in Australia and other places than a solar evaporation setup. There's kind of a 2 to 3 year. It's slower getting the kind of solar evaporation process going, and they produce slightly different versions of lithium from the two different methodologies, which then require slightly different refining onwards to make them into the useful chemical that you actually need for batteries. So, and for most batteries you see today, the South American output is preferred, but for some other batteries, the mined product is preferred. So there's a bit of 50-50 on it. So it's quite a big process, and like all extractive processes, there is an environmental cost. There are issues around, destruction of habitat, destruction of landscape, contamination of watercourses, and again, it all comes down to how well is it regulated, how much do the people buying the lithium put pressure on the people doing the mining to operate insofar as is possible, which you're digging a very, very large hole in the ground to minimize their environmental impact. So, there's a definite issue there. There's a definite concern that I think it's, one needs to be mindful of. So I guess what's the current state of lithium in terms of, the world? Looking across, you see the reserves. South America has the biggest reserves of lithium in the world by quite some way. Obviously, Bolivia's currently is working on commercializing the lithium reserves it's sitting on. And I guess as quite a poor country, they see this as a good opportunity for themselves. But of the South Americans, actually, Argentina is the furthest ahead in terms of lithium commercialization. And you'll note that Australia, while the fourth largest reserves, is actually the world's leading exporter currently in terms of extractor and producer of lithium ore. And then most of it's consumed in China. And actually, the Australian situation is, of course, that most of the lithium they dig up is actually exported to China. And that's where it goes. Now, as it happens, because most of the world's lithium processing capability is also in China, pretty much all your lithium that gets dug up, 70, 80% of it, is then shipped to China to be processed into the useful chemicals, the actual compounds that you can use in batteries. Which kind of raises another thing about, obviously, it's traveling, and that's quite an energy-intensive process. And while China has made vast steps in terms of cleaning up its, bringing in renewable energy and cleaning up its grid, there's still an awful lot of coal in China's energy mix for electricity generation. So that is another kind of, and we'll touch again on that when we talk about the embedding of carbon. But it does, it adds a certain level of question into the process. But that's, so then say, well, okay, is there enough lithium? And I dug around a bit, and they said currently there's about 10 kilograms of lithium in the for the want of a better average battery electric vehicle. So you get about 100 cars out of a ton of lithium. Now, the global market for light commercial vehicle, light duty vehicles, is about 100 million units a year. That's cars, vans, and so you pretty reckon about a million tons of lithium a year would get you out of that. And if you look at that, if you look at even just the top 5 countries, there's about 60 million tons of reserves available, without getting into, Portugal and Canada and the other places where we're now finding lithium. So there's certainly enough lithium, I think, to be getting on with. But of course, we have to bear in mind that it isn't just used in cars. It's used in phones and, pretty much every consumer device that has a battery has a lithium-ion battery in it. And there are other uses for lithium in industry as well. But, on the face of it, the reserves would seem adequate for where we are and what we're doing. And there's some variables around that, I guess. You could say that, there's a lot of pressure around range on electric vehicles. And one of the ways to achieve more range is to go for bigger batteries. And if you go for a bigger battery, you're going to need more lithium. So if we suddenly all said, oh, we had to have 500 miles of range, 600 miles of range, it's very likely we would be consuming twice as much lithium per car, without big advances in technology. But that said, there is innovation. There's a constant evolution in batteries. And while many people, there's big hopes for big jumps, but we are seeing a kind of slow, fairly constant evolution. And may reduce the amount of lithium per kilowatt hour of the battery. And as we get further into this process, and we'll look at this in a moment, there's the potentially for recycling of lithium that's already in use. So we're reducing the demand for extracting new lithium. So they all have kind of variables that might push the demand up and down. But certainly if we really want to take 1 million tons of lithium out of the ground, that would be a huge jump in the level of extraction we're doing. So that would be, a challenge. But that's roughly at today's level of efficiency what it would take to meet the 100 million globally delivered light vehicle units. And I guess it's fair to observe that that's just light duty vehicles. So that's not trucks. It's not anything else. That's up to about the size of probably about a 5-ton van. You could take it as a kind of global standard. So it's anything, cars, vans, that kind of thing, but not trucks, not anything heavy, not earth-moving equipment, a whole bunch of other things that have to sit in there in the mix of it. So that's the lithium picture. It's quite diverse. The processing of lithium is something that people are trying to, I guess, increase the capacity. Certainly the European Union is trying to incentivize lithium refining within the European Union so as to reduce the dependence on China. And if you like to take more control of the value chain. And there's also some looked at some of the lithium mining countries are looking at this saying, well, actually, we're digging up the raw material. Most of the value creation is actually happening in China. So they want to take some more control of that. So it's likely over time, we'll see a build out in capacity in other markets, in Europe, in the USA, to take lithium, say, from Argentina to North America and refine it there, rather than potentially currently where it's dug up in South America, gets sent to China, gets processed, may or not built into a battery there, and then sent back to North America to be put into a car. So that's improvements we will see over time as the industry builds out. So the other and somewhat more contentious ingredient really is cobalt. It's the other big part of the battery. Now, cobalt is in fact relatively rare, unlike lithium, which we seem to be able to find pretty much not quite anywhere, but there's a lot of it lying around. Cobalt, estimates something like 70% of the world's reserves is in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, one of those nice stable countries. And as a result of the problems that DRC has had over years, it's not a largely well-regulated mining environment, and there's a lot of what they refer to as artisanal mining, which a little like artisan bread is somewhat informal and challenging. So there's a lot of discussions, there's allegations of child labor in it. There's issues around the cobalt itself is a relatively toxic material to work with. So that's, that raises some real questions. And obviously with very informal mining, you're not, where it's not been done by a, global multinational who may have some eye on, their image. It's the standards of people, just digging it out of the ground, fairly very low attention to what might be the health impact, what might be the concerns. It's very easy to see how that creeps in. So that is definitely a problem with the cobalt side of the battery, and it makes, it's currently cobalt is the thing that makes batteries work. And it's also very expensive. It's in terms of cost, it's the biggest proportion of the cost of a vehicle battery currently. So it costs a lot more than lithium. And that, I guess, comes down to this, it's all in one place, essentially. So that all adds to it. But so cobalt is quite a difficult subject for the battery industry. People would like to get away from it, but we're not there yet. So again, very much like the lithium situation, what happens is all of our predominantly cobalt is dug up in Africa, in the DRC. It's shipped to China, where it's processed, and then it's shipped from there. Either in China, it's made into things like batteries or consumer goods, or a lot of it goes to South Korea or to Japan to be built into consumer goods. But none of the value creation chain is happening in Africa. It's all literally dug out the ground, shipped to Africa, shipped to China, and then processed and smelted there. So all that works in there, but the bringing out the ground is very much an African enterprise. So is cobalt essential? Well, maybe. I mean, currently it is. It's in most consumer batteries. There's people are looking at alternatives to different types of batteries that use less cobalt, but they have performance issues. They're slower to charge. They have lower energy density, so you get less charge for weight of battery, and particularly for vehicle applications, that's a problem. That means you've got less energy density. You're getting less range out of the same 300-400 kilograms of battery pack that you're putting into the vehicle. So if someone, range is one of the big concerns people have. So that taking out cobalt means suddenly you may be in fact losing range, and that's a problem. There are people, everyone recognizes that there are issues around cobalt, both in terms of how it's extracted and the fact that there's the reserves of it are all in pretty much one country. And so there's work looking for alternatives. Not that there are issues. I mean, Tesla are very much pushing nickel. They have a nickel battery chemistry that they're very keen on, but bringing nickel out the ground, has its own problems. So there's a number of, currently there isn't a great alternative to cobalt. There's a lot of work being done on it, but it's still where we are. And so the question is, can through regulation, through market forces, can the way it's produced in the DRC, can that be improved to make it more acceptable? So that's the kind of predominantly what goes into batteries. Now the other thing is people occasionally about rare earth metals, which are very China-centric, which I haven't touched on here, but the lithium and cobalt in terms of their extraction are the ones that people tend to be concerned about as the environmental impact of those two. Now, the other side of the equation that people are often concerned about is what happens to batteries at the end of life. That you stick about, and I think we all have the experience with our phones where, you get them, they're great to start with, and pretty rapidly they start to degrade. And car batteries have a similar, traction batteries have a similar degradation. Not similar, they suffer from degradation. It's much slower. There are a number of variables about how they're used that impact it. But so far, I mean, we're about 10 years into, mainstream battery technology. Degradation has not been a massive issue.
Yeah.
But what happens? But we are starting to get to the point where people are looking at, well, okay, when batteries are no longer fit for purpose in a vehicle, and vehicles are quite a demanding application. They're again, because of the issue about range, the issues about performance, and the fact they're used in all kinds of weathers. All of those things mean that vehicle batteries are among the most demanding applications for them. So what happens when either A, the battery isn't fit for use, or B, if the vehicle's scrapped? It's in an accident, it's just reached the end of its useful life as a vehicle, but there's still a battery in it. What happens with them there? But the first thing is there's a whole second life of batteries that needs to be considered. You can see the image here that people like Renault is in the European context. Renault and Nissan have been delivering electric vehicles for the longest time. They come up in about 10 years. And because the way they originally delivered their vehicles with a rental scheme, they own a lot of their batteries and will get them back at the end of the vehicle life. And so a lot of them actually are still perfectly good for static applications, second life. So grid scale storage, which is that container is in the picture, where you use it as grid stabilization for renewable energy. So the classic, when there's lots of solar and wind and not enough demand, you just store it in these pre-used car batteries in big blocks. And because you've then got hundreds of them, the fact that some of them aren't, some are better, some are slightly better, some are slightly worse, kind of evens itself out. And the application, it's not as exposed to temperature and demand, so that works. There's also some conversion into uses as domestic storage, i.e. house batteries. That's also an option that you can use it locally. And Nissan certainly have looked into the idea of offering pre-used Nissan vehicle batteries as a cheap alternative to a new battery. I'm not sure where they are with that in terms of commercializing that, but it's definitely on their agenda. And the other thing is, if you like, the DIY electric vehicle conversion market. So the kind of people who say, you know what, I will take this 15-year-old BMW or Volvo or whatever it is, and using an amount of skill, ingenuity, and cunning, which I personally lack, using a second-hand battery and second-hand motors, build themselves an electric vehicle. And yes, it won't have the performance of a new electric vehicle in terms of range, but actually they may not care. They may go, well, actually, it's pretty cheap. There's a guy in Ireland who does a lot of this by buying up second-hand batteries from vehicles from Norway that have been in accidents. So they've Norway's the most evolved electric vehicle market in Europe by a long way, but they have a pretty lousy weather as well. So there's quite a lot of vehicles that get written off through being in accidents. So he buys the batteries up, or he also out of Toyota hybrids, and the motors from hybrids, the batteries from other vehicles, and puts them together and makes, for a couple of €1,000, makes himself an okay, very usable electric vehicle, and runs classes now for other people, anybody in the market, to teach them how to make their own electric vehicles, should they wish to do so. So second life, that's one way. And then the other option is recycling. Now, the good news is that car batteries are very big, a couple of 100 kilos, and so they're very valuable. There's a lot of stuff in them. Also, car manufacturers have for some years had what's called an end-of-life vehicle directive, which puts a duty on the manufacturers around the recycling of vehicle components. So they can't just go, as they did back in the old days, well, that car's now dead, it's nothing to do with us. They have an obligation to make it recyclable and to ensure there is some level of recycling happening. And we're already seeing with the Europeans, with Renault and with Volkswagen, them taking steps to put that in place. Renault are actually further ahead because they've got more batteries coming back. They've recently just opened what they call a refactory facility in France. That is part of a recycling process. And Volkswagen, who have been selling small numbers of electric vehicles and have just gone into full volume electric vehicle production, are piloting a process, and they very handily provided me some slides, so I was certainly making them. And they have a process. They analyze them. There's the idea that they will indeed go for second life. Can they find a further use for the battery? Or failing that, it goes into discharge, disassembly, and recycling. And the recycling process, well, they discharge the batteries, partly because charged batteries are incredibly dangerous, if you as a thing to work with, and also they recoup the energy that's left in them. So they fully discharge them, but they're mechanically disassembled to recover, the parts that can be recovered in that way. And then they're shredded. What's left, you shred the cells, dry out the electrolyte, sieve out your nickel, manganese, cobalt, and lithium, the really valuable bits, graphite, use a magnet to recover the iron, and then do a bit of separation for some aluminium, copper, and plastic. So it's a very thorough process. Now, if you compare that to, say, a mobile phone, where there's also have little lithium-ion batteries, because it's so small, what happens with these, if they're recycled at all, is what they call is thermo recovery. Basically, they stick them in a furnace and they smelt them. They melt them down and recover what they can. But what happens with that is things like the lithium that come out can't then be reused in a battery because of insufficient grade. So this much more intensive process does allow them to recover materials of a grade and quality that can be fed back into recycling to create a more circular economy and to reduce the amount of new material that would be required over time. But it's certainly quite a labor-intensive process and quite demanding. How much do you get back? Well, here they give an example of a 400 kilogram traction battery, car battery. Various things come out of it, but of the 400 grams, effectively 90% of it's recoverable. So there's 41 kilogram they reckon is residual that they can't reclaim. So, that's pretty good in terms of minimizing the waste at the end of when the battery really hasn't got any of the use. Be able to say, oh, actually 90% of that's recoverable. So I guess it gets into the real question about, are batteries green or not? Well, they're not without an environmental cost, in terms of cobalt extraction, lithium mining, lithium evaporation, all those things do come with a environmental cost. They are in developing area technology. There's been significant reasonably significant changes. There's about once a month there's somebody claiming to have a big breakthrough in batteries, and then they normally go very quiet shortly afterwards. Usually after they've done a round of fundraising, then they go very quiet, and it all that never seems to quite come. But batteries are incrementally getting better. There is evolution with them. And it's undoubtable that batteries will play a big part in decarbonisation of a whole range of applications. All kinds of transportation, potentially in domestic settings as well. If you start looking at things like grid scale storage, house batteries, all of those things can play a role, particularly when linked into renewable energy sources as a way to maximize the energy from renewables, to provide grid stability, to provide localization of power supplies. There's all kinds of things you can do with batteries, not just put them in vehicles. But currently, actually, electric vehicles are really driving the innovation in battery, because electric vehicles are seen as a big demand. They're a very demanding application for running electric vehicles, that they are actually really pushing the investment, the battery chemistry, and the science that's going on is really being driven predominantly by electric vehicles. So all those other uses that we will get out of those will, at least in part, come because currently electric vehicles are where the action is. And I think it's fair to say that at least today, they're the best alternative to burning fossil fuels for transport. As an option to propelling a vehicle, electricity and a battery, as things stand today, are probably the best options. Now, again, there are other things that are happening in the background. Fuel cells we can talk about if anyone's interested, which are I think are probably about where batteries were 5-10 years ago, in that They're just being deployed by a very small number of manufacturers. There's some big infrastructure questions. But it's you know it's a technology with a great deal of promise, and a lot of the smart money in the industry thinks that it's going to be what actually works for heavy transportation. So trucks, trains, boats, and planes, kind of thing, are likely to end up with fuel cell vehicles, fuel cell propelled. Then the question becomes, if that's how, say, heavy trucks are being powered, does it move back down into lighter vehicles, vans, cars, etc.? There's some different dynamics about refueling and energy use and efficiency, and it's one of the things we could have a whole. If anyone fancies it, we'll have a whole other conversation about fuel cell electric vehicles versus battery electric vehicles another time, because there's a lot. And again, like one of those things where there are people who are really evangelical on both sides, who will say, oh, there are battery electric people who say fuel cells are a complete waste of time and effort, and people investing in them are just wasting the money. And people on the fuel cell side who say, oh, batteries are as a technology is going to peak, and that fuel cells, because you get away from that issue of recharging, and you're back to very much you can go and fill up in a couple of minutes, is really where the future is. And I don't know the answer to that, but it's definitely on an interesting discussion, I think, to be had, an interesting debate to be had around that. And then the other thing that's come up quite recently is synthetic fuels. God alone knows how they're going to work out. But again, that's being touted as a solution. But again, that's incredibly early days. I mean, there's literally at the, there's a small scale pilot running in Germany. And I think a lot of the people who are, fossil fuel-y types are going, oh, this is great. This is really going to solve the problem. But they're talking about making, a couple of 100,000 liters in a world that consumes, frankly, tens of millions of barrels of fuel. So they're a long way off that being a viable alternative. So that's my bit about batteries. Happy to take questions. Whether I can answer them or not remains to be seen. But happy to take any if there are any, or just what are people's thoughts, really. Enough of me talking, frankly.
Thank you, Damien. That was really, really interesting, and I'm really glad that because I don't know if anyone else wastes time on Facebook comment page about these kind of things, but I read a lot of comments about people saying about the negative side of it. So it's really useful just to be able to put that into context and have more of an understanding of that side of things. So thank you. That was really informative. Yeah, I imagine probably people might well have some questions. Yeah, so if anyone does, do feel free to put your hands up or use the Zoom equivalent of the Teams hands up button just to make sure we can spot you. Or just unmute yourselves and shout out. That's fine as well.
Nicholas Cox has raised his hand, apparently.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
I've been driving hybrids since the Prius Mark II.
Yep.
I've got a Honda hybrid that's, I reckon, 11 years old now that I want to change this year.
Uh-huh.
I need to be able to drive as far as Gloucestershire on a single charge. Would you recommend going all electric at this stage?
Well, so how far is my geography is terrible, you have to forgive me. So how far is your journey to Gloucestershire, do you think?
120 miles each way, but I can plug in to get there.
You plug in at the other end. Well, you can certainly do it. I mean, if you look even at quite a small electric car now, like a Renault Zoe, that kind of range is definitely very doable for it. Midwinter, if it's 10 degrees below, you might struggle a bit more. One of the things I haven't got into on this is the issue of weather impact on battery range, which does have a vary. But yeah, if you say the longest journey you do is 110, 120 miles, there are very affordable EVs these days on the market that will give you getting on for 200 miles range. There's an
Perfect.
MG, the latest Nissans, certainly the Hyundais, Kias. You know, that they will easily do that kind of range, that you could comfortably make that journey, charge at your destination or fast charge near your destination, and make the journey back without any great problem. And I guess we'll maybe touch on that a little bit when we talk about plug-in hybrids, which would be the other alternative you could look at to say, well, actually, you know, one of the things about buying a full electric is you pay a premium for the fact you're buying a battery that enables you to do that 100 and something plus mile journey. Now, if you said to me, actually, I only do that journey once a year, you then say, well, actually, the rest of the year, you've got 200 miles worth of range, 160 miles worth of range. You really don't need, and that's but that's feel like it's something we can we can circle back to when we talk about plug-in hybrids at the end of this, if that's okay with you. But yeah, but it's certainly it's doable currently, and that's without going to kind of the top end of the market. If you look at the latest Volkswagens, Kias, Hyundais, you can get that kind of range in an electric vehicle. Yes.
You mentioned the MG, which is one of the more affordable long-range ones.
Yes.
Are there any issues with it being built in China? Like they're using slave labor?
I honestly, that is not. I could not answer that question for you.
No. Okay.
Yeah, that's very specific, I'm afraid. And yeah, you know, there are potentials with it being a Chinese-built vehicle for how it's constructed. And I can't speak to the labor question, but also you'd need to consider the issue that, you know, again, if you just look upon in terms of the energy being used to build it, purely from an environmental impact, you know, the essential fuel mix, if you look at the overall fuel mix in China, it's not particularly clean. Yes, they've taken huge steps in terms of introducing renewables into their energy mix, in terms of solar and wind. You know, they've done a great deal. But that's in the context of they're expanding their power generation enormously. And so a big part of what they generate is still generated off coal. So now, as a factory, they could say, oh no, we only buy clean renewable energy. But you know, but I can't say they do or they don't. That's not something I can speak to. I've never done anything with them as a brand. You know, I just know that certainly in terms of, you know, consumer usage of it, people say it's a perfectly acceptable, you know, electric vehicle. It's not the most swanky, but it does the job.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks
Okay,
ever so much.
no problem.
Thank you.
David Middlemiss, I think you had your hand up next.
Yeah. Hi, Damien.
Hello.
Hi, Damien. In terms, you mentioned the hydrogen fuel cell.
Yes.
How does that compare with respect to components to just the standard lithium cobalt batteries?
Well, it is a sort of discussion for another day. There are more components, and what you tend to find most fuel cell vehicles, they also have a small battery in them, and that seems to be the way the technology balance is going, is that with fuel cells, people want at least to have some stored energy as well. Now, much smaller. There are a number, and because there aren't really any on the market, I can't speak to the chemicals used in the fuel cell process, because realistically, you can't today, as a consumer in the UK, buy a fuel cell vehicle. There are a couple out there, you know, there are Toyota Miras running around, but they're really all on the basis of testing at this stage. You know, they're being used with selective users. It's not, so it's nothing I can answer you at this stage. I'm happy to, you know, if we circle back to this as a future date, a discussion about fuel cell versus battery electric vehicle, we can have a look into it. The criticism that's normally raised is less about componentage, but about pure efficiency. That people say, look, if you have electricity, you got two choices. You know, you can either charge a battery with it, or you can make hydrogen with it. You know, a few things you can do. And the battery proponents say, actually, if you go, you know, solar power, charge battery, use that battery to propel a vehicle, you know, you've got kind of 80% plus efficiency. If you do solar power, make electricity, make hydrogen, put hydrogen into a car, use the hydrogen fuel cell process to make electricity, use that to drive the car. There's a lot more energy loss. There's a lot more efficiency loss in the process. And that's one of the criticisms of it. You're effectively losing a lot of your stored power in the process. Now, the hydrogen people say it's getting better, and B, if the energy was potentially going to be wasted otherwise, what is it? Hydrogen is you can make it anytime and store it whenever you like. So there are pros and cons, but I can't speak to what goes into the fuel cell vehicles, I'm afraid.
Great, thanks, Damien. Dick Warner, I can see you've got your hands up.
It was just to say, in answer to Nick Cox, we bought a Renault Zoe, a 2016 second-hand, 2 or 3 years ago, and we know Slimbridge quite well on the basis of a trip we did the year before last, I think it was. There is no problem getting there on one charge, and we've refilled just outside Gloucester, I think, and came back with no problem. So I can recommend a Zoe. I think they are very good, even though ours is a little bit old, a bit long in the tooth, and there are much better ones to be had now. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
No.
Great, thanks, Dick. Andrew, you've got your hands up.
Yeah, my question was going to be about towing capacity. At the moment, I use a Mitsubishi FEV, and it manages to tow my caravan or my boat. Caravan weighs in at 1,500, and it does well. What do you see as, or do you know much about the development that's going to be happening for towing vehicles?
The towing is an interesting area. Particularly as in fact, my particular interest in current interest in electric vehicles is around vans and commercial vehicles. And currently one of the big problems with electric commercial vehicles is towing, and for their own reasons, manufacturers have mostly decided not to rate them for towing. It's a plating issue. So they've decided that rather than going for as you would typically get on a combustion engine vehicle, where they may have, anything from about 700 kilos up to 3,500 kilos on a commercial vehicle, they're plating them down to very low values, which I think is an efficiency thing. About they are concerned that as a tow vehicle, the dynamics of how that works will rapidly discharge the battery more quickly than it would normal. So it is coming, but it's in that mix of things about, because it does pull the range down very comparatively rapidly because of the way it works. It remains, at this moment in time, it remains an issue. It remains a problem. And I don't think I said, even looking at commercial vehicles, without going up to some of the really big ones, towing remains a problem even in electric vans as we speak, let alone cars, I'm afraid to say.
Also, thank you very much for giving me the insight as the environmental aspect of creating the batteries. Food for thought there. Thank you.
No problem. Are we done? And we move on to the exciting world of embedded carbon. Okay, all right. I am going to trust that we're okay. No one's got a hand up that I can see. So the other thing I thought was hopefully interesting to talk about, was there's a big fuss a couple of weeks ago about a study that came out via Aston Martin about the idea of embedded carbon, which is embedded carbon is what's the carbon cost of making the thing. And it's really part of an effort to understand what's the true carbon impact of vehicles over their whole life. So it's what's the carbon cost of making it, and then that's added to its in-service carbon emissions to give a much better picture, rather than just looking at the emissions in use. This was never really an area of science until electric vehicles came along, and then everyone, there's zero emission. And of course, they're only zero emission at what we'd call at tailpipe. So yes, at the point you're driving it, there are zero emissions, but there are potentially emissions in other places, and one of those is in construction. Now, this is a wildly contentious area of debate around how the numbers stack up, how many miles you have to do to trade them back. But we'll have a wade into these likely shark-infested waters and just to, I guess, explore the issues a bit, and if not to come up with definite answers. So the easy stuff, everyone agrees that battery electric vehicles have a higher carbon embedded in them in production. Okay, and that's mainly to do with the batteries. So making a big-ish, 400 kilogram electric battery for an electric vehicle, that takes a lot of energy, and so you embed a lot of carbon into your vehicle in the process. And obviously, the bigger the battery, the more carbon you've embedded. So if you go for a long range ID3, there's more carbon embedded in that than in a regular range. And the same if you go for a Tesla, the bigger the battery, the more carbon you start off with, carbon debt, if you will. But they have a much lower carbon cost in operation. So, that's the trade-off. On the other side, well, internal combustion engine vehicles have a lower carbon cost of production, but obviously they have a higher carbon cost in operation. So that's the two sides of the equation. Now, there's some variables and a lot of arguments about this, relative merits of how these two trade off against each other and how it all works. But you will see quite a lot of discussion about it. Now, Volkswagen, who are very nice people, relatively, at least currently, produced a nice graphic for this, which is kind of handy. And if you look at the yellow bars, so they compared a Volkswagen Golf, so a petrol Golf, a diesel Golf, and the ID3, which is the nearest equivalent they have in an electric vehicle. And the yellow is the production phase, so how much carbon's embedded in the making. And as you can see, the ID3 is roughly double, 13.7 against, about 7. So slightly under double the amount of carbon embedded in it. So practically speaking, now, if you were going to buy a car and park it outside your house, and then trade it in and keep it for 10 years for emergencies, actually a gasoline car would have a lower carbon cost if you never drove it, because actually it's only cost 6.8 tons of CO2 to get it built. But obviously where things start to change pretty rapidly is as soon as you start driving them, where you see that then the numbers start to move up quite quickly. So the pale blue number is the energy production. And obviously for an electric vehicle, it's all energy production. But there's also for diesel and for gasoline, there's a fuel production cost of CO2. And then also when you literally burn it, there's the CO2 release. But obviously there's three, so there's for a combustion engine vehicle, there's CO2 embedded in the vehicle, there's the CO2 embedded in the fuel through refining, and then there's the CO2 released when you actually burn it. But you can see it would take a while for a gasoline vehicle to catch up with the nearly 14 tons of carbon you've embedded in buying yourself a new ID3, a new electric vehicle. Now, as I said, that there are variables around this, and they mainly come down to stuff around how where the electricity comes from and what happens with all these things. But it's undoubtedly true. You start with an electric vehicle with a higher carbon debt if you buy a new one. Now, it has got better. I mean, Volkswagen, I said, have been in the electric vehicle business a little while. Their previous model, which was the electric e-Golf, they've done this comparison saying that, well, if you look at the creation of the battery, there's 48% less carbon produced from on the right measure for the ID3 versus the Golf. So from one generation of vehicle to the next generation, they've been able to halve, the amount of carbon, nearly half the amount of carbon being produced if you produce the same size batteries. Now, as it happens, the ID3 has a bigger battery. So, but if you look in terms of, kilowatt hour, per kilowatt hour, it's much more efficient. So that's allowing for some mitigation measures, and some of that is about the design of the battery. It's newer technology, it's more efficient, and a chunk of it is actually they've migrated the creation of the battery to a renewable energy, so tier one supplier. So they know it's renewable energy, and they're able to take so there's no carbon cost of that energy. So the biggest variable in this kind of trying to do a electric vehicle versus internal combustion comparison is how the electricity is generated, and that's both in terms of vehicle production and the vehicle in use. And so certainly if you look at Volkswagen and Renault, the European ones, they are making a real kind of effort at saying, look, we're doing everything we can with renewable energy that we can control and we can bring on board. It gets a little murkier with people, the Chinese people at the EMG, the Chinese manufacturers, where there's less transparency. And even in most countries, certainly in Europe, certainly in the UK, and I guess even in China and maybe even in America now, the grid's getting cleaner. So as you go from year to year, there's more renewables, there's lower carbon coming into it. So whenever someone brings up this issue of embedded carbon as a reason not to buy an electric vehicle, I guess my feeling is always this, that yes, you start with a higher carbon debt, but an electric vehicle purchased now, over time, over the 10, 15 years of life experience of that vehicle, will probably get cleaner for every mile it does. Even if you're not running it off your own solar panels, you're just running it off the grid. As time goes on, it will emit lower emissions going forward. Whereas an internal combustion engine vehicle, at best, it'll emit the same emissions. And I think we'd all seen those diesel vehicles that are a couple of years old and are actually, haven't been serviced properly. The emissions on them are actually quite a lot worse. So, I think even there is this issue of carbon debt. Electric vehicles still have a better future carbon footprint, and yes, they might. That's the great discussion about, is it 20,000 kilometers? Is it 80,000 kilometers? Is it 100,000 kilometers? To offset the embedded carbon extra embedded carbon in a battery electric vehicle versus an internal combustion engine vehicle. Partly that's down to how you measure the embedded carbon. Partly it's down to how clean is your electricity grid. There are places, I think West Virginia in the States is one, where it is actually cleaner to drive a petrol car than to drive an electric one, because their electricity generation is so dirty. It's all coal, and not very clean coal either. Realistically, you're actually worse driving an electric vehicle than driving a petrol one today. Now, whether in 5 years' time that'll have changed, I don't know. But there are places in the world genuinely where the electricity grid is so bad, so dirty, electric vehicles really don't work. But they're very few, and the UK is not one of them. There are lots of options here to buy renewable energy to get on board with those. And I guess the other thing is, and there was certainly a report I think came out a couple of days ago saying about, with internal combustion vehicles, we also tend not to consider things like oil, antifreeze, spark plugs, a whole range of other consumable items that over the 10-year service life of that vehicle add up. There's a huge additional level of consumption, as well as just the fuel that's being burnt. All of those other things are having to go into it as well that are not required for an electric vehicle. So yes, embedded carbon is an issue, but if you weigh up the balance of it, it's not it's not the kind of killer I think people sometimes believe it is. So I hope that was interesting. Any thoughts, questions about on the subject of embedding of carbon? Carbon embedding was obviously too dull. Wait once. Cool. Right. Right. Well, if no one has a question about carbon, my last topic that I prepared for anyway was this question of plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. And as I said, if you hang out a little bit on forums for electric vehicles, you'll see people are very down often on plug-in hybrid vehicles. So I thought we'd explore that and just talk about it a bit. So what are we? Well, I'm sure most people know, and certainly Andrew, who owns one, will know. A plug-in hybrid combines a battery, electric motor, with an internal combustion engine. Sometimes referred to as plug-in hybrids, sometimes referred to as range extender hybrids. You get two types typically. You get a type where both the engine and the motor can drive the wheels. And increasingly what we see now, like if you, anybody been in a new, those new electric taxis, they're a plug-in hybrid. Okay, so they have a diesel engine, I believe it's diesel, that acts as a generator, but never drives the wheels. So the wheels are always driven by the electric motor. But the engine is sufficient size that it's able to generate enough power to, effectively, via the battery, drive the motor that runs the wheels. So the idea is if you're a taxi driver and you live in where, for instance, you would charge up your battery at home, you would drive into London on your extended engine. You would then operate in London on your batteries during the day and recharge as necessary. And then potentially on your way home, if you didn't have the range, you would use your petrol or your diesel engine again to get you home. So they're a very advanced plug-in hybrid, but as everything in the plug-in hybrid market, from Mitsubishi Outlanders, which are the best-selling plug-in hybrid vehicle in Europe, a whole range of people, Mini offer them, Range Rovers offer them. They're very much an area of technology. EV-only range is typically kind of sub 40, 50 miles. It is increasing. It used to be kind of sub 30 miles, and then the threshold under legislation is often the way these things got pushed up. So the manufacturers started to try to make them a bit more efficient and to frankly, put slightly bigger batteries in them. But often that's the range you get. You get something like 30 to 40 miles of electric-only driving out of a plug-in hybrid. So so that's kind of what you get. So the case against plug-in hybrids is that they still have an engine. Okay, they're still capable of producing emissions. They're a bit of a halfway house. They're neither one thing nor the other, and they're potentially very complex. In the sense that they've got both. So they've got a battery. They've got a motor, they've got an engine, you still have to have a radiator and coolant and oil. So you've kind of ended up with everything. It's a more complicated system than just an internal combustion engine or just an electric vehicle. So, that's the argument against. People say, well, it's ridiculous, it's extra weight, it's very complicated, it all still needs servicing. It's and it's a dead end technology. They say, well, you can buy a Renault Zoe, you can drive 150 miles on it. Why do you need these things? I guess the argument in favor of plug-in hybrids is they're very flexible. Okay, so you have no concept of range anxiety in the market as it exists today. If you need to get in your plug-in hybrid and drive from here to, I don't know, Edinburgh, you might need to stop for fuel, for 5 minutes for petrol, but you wouldn't need to stop to recharge in the way you would with an electric vehicle, which might take, might need to make one or more stops to recharge. That could take, 30, 40 minutes at a time. They're significantly cheaper. If you compare a Renault Zoe, what is 52 kilowatt hour battery with a Renault Capor, I think it's pronounced, their plug-in hybrid, only has a 9.8 kilowatt battery, 30-mile range, but one's just under £20,000, and one, even after the plug-in grant, is just under £27,000. There's a very big difference in cost. And then obviously the smaller battery means that there's less embedded carbon if you buy a plug-in hybrid like a Capor versus a Zoe. And that's really where so the question is, well, okay, it's a 30 miles range. is that adequate? You know, what is it? How does that sit? Well, you know, it's hard to judge. I meant to make this a build, I forgot. But the average car journey in the UK is apparently 8.4 miles. And the average person makes 1.1 journeys per person per day. And that's both either as a driver by themselves or as a driver or passenger in a vehicle, you know, all told. So the question is this. So if you're really doing, let's call it 10 miles a day, do you really need a battery capable of 200 miles? Given that it's going to cost you an extra £10,000, it's going to have a bigger carbon level of carbon embedded in it. When actually, you know, your 30-mile Capur would perform for you as an electric vehicle. Now, and in on the occasion when you wanted to drive to Gloucestershire, yes, you'd have to use the petrol engine, and it would be very relatively inefficient because it would also have the weight of a battery in it. So there is just that that kind of question. And so where I come to on plug-in hybrids is, you know, are they evil? It really depends. One of the problems, I think, where they got a bit of a bad reputation is a few years back, plug-ins did very well on company car taxation. They were very, very cheap. And I certainly know from an interview, said, oh yeah, the Mitsubishi Outlanders would get sold as company vehicles. They'd come back after 3-4 years and obviously never been charged. You know, people had bought them as company vehicles because of how efficient they were on taxation. And they drove them on petrol all the time. You know, they didn't care. So actually, they were very inefficient. But if you and I didn't. There was a thing in the Guardian, I think, today about, or something which have released a report saying, "Oh, plug-in hybrid vehicles, you know, the emissions are much higher than they are in test." And the answer is yes, I'm sure they are. Partly because the people who do test driving for the industry, their job literally is to minimize the what the score is, the emission score is on the test. But it's very ideal, you know, it's a very the mixture of driving on the tests while very consistent represents a kind of an odd combination. Now, if you drive a plug-in hybrid 50, 60, 70 miles a day, you're not getting that much, 100 miles a day, you're not getting that much EV motoring relative to how much internal combustion motoring you're getting. But if you're someone who says, no, actually, what I use my car for is to go to the shops, or I commute to work, my job is 8-9 miles away, 10 miles away, and I drive home again and I can recharge my car. For me, I think they're a very valid option, you know, to consider. That they are good. You know, they're cheaper, they have less embedded carbon, and they will do the job, and they won't restrain you in terms of being able to say, oh, actually, something's come up, I need to go somewhere. Now, I'm not saying they're for everyone, but you know, I'd like people to not discount them just because they're not full electric vehicles. So it's a conclusion. They're not ready for me to draw, but I would say, look, if you're in the market for a vehicle and you're considering an electric vehicle, you really want to think about how you use your vehicle. You know, how you would charge a vehicle with a plug, either a plug-in hybrid or a battery electric. You know, where would you be able to plug it in? How would you plug it in? How would you recharge it? Just because you can't plug it at home doesn't mean you can't have an electric vehicle. It probably means you shouldn't consider a plug-in hybrid because they have very small batteries. So the whole trying to deal with public charging probably isn't worth the effort. But for a battery electric vehicle, there are people who quite happily running them off public charging. It's not as cheap, but it does the job very well. How green is it if you're plugging it, charging at home? How green is your supply? You know, are you signed up to somebody with renewable energy? And the last thing I would say, and I shouldn't say this because I work in the automotive industry, but actually would something else meet your needs? You know, if really you're using your car to go 4 miles to work, whatever, would an electric bike do you? You know, there's a whole generation of other electrified vehicles coming to market, bikes, trikes, a whole bunch of stuff with, you know, 10, 15, 20, 30 miles of range that aren't cars, and they're much smaller, they're much lighter weight, they've much less emissions embedded in them. And they're a really, really interesting area of developing transportation that will come along. And sometimes actually you would better say, you know what, actually for 90% of my use, what I could actually have is an electric bike, and in 3 times a year I could rent a car to go on holiday, and it would cost you less money. It would be reasonably environmentally friendly. There's a whole range of options about looking at different ways of tackling that transportation question, other than maybe buying a new electric vehicle. I guess the other thing to say is, if you've currently have a combustion engine vehicle of an age, and you don't do a lot of miles in it, I should own up here and say I have a petrol car. It's 17 years old, so it's not the cleanest thing in the world. But for various reasons, I do about 3,000 miles a year, 4,000 miles a year in my vehicle. So actually to replace it with a new vehicle, would actually it would take me forever to work off the carbon debt I would create in my usage. So just to kind of, if you've got a vehicle, you're not using it a lot, in a way, there's a thing about saying if you keep it serviced and that's not a bad, in itself, a bad option. Now, if you're doing 20,000 miles a year in a 17-year-old vehicle, that's a pretty terrible option. But you just need to think about how you use your vehicle, what the impact of that is, and feed that into your decision-making process about an electric vehicle, be it a battery electric vehicle or a plug-in hybrid vehicle, or even the kind of, the whole wonderful world of hybrids, of the Prius style, which is the full hybrid, and the increasingly odd things that are known as mild hybrids, or as I like to think of them as not very hybrids at all, which, also exist and can have a role for people. It's really about what your use case is and buying the vehicle that matches your use case and then using it that way. Okay, that's my last topic. I'm again happy to take thoughts, questions, and observations. Did want this to be a dialogue rather than just me talking. And hopefully that was interesting and answers some of your questions. But if there's other things that people are interested in, feel free to ask. I'll endeavour to answer it, and if not, we may have to circle back at a future date.
Great, thank you so much, Damien. That's a good point about if you hardly ever use your car, you're probably better off just keeping it than going electric. Great, thank you, Andrew. I can see you've got your hands up.
Yeah, I think my summary would be that you kind of, it would be better just to travel by train. Maybe if there's less people commuting on trains, there would be more space made to kind of have bike racks, so you cycle to the station, get on the train, hang the bike up like they do in Switzerland, and then at the other end, get your bike out again. Preferably, not an electric bike because that's got a battery. And
the nice thing in defense of electric bikes is what people often worry about using bikes for commuting, because you get hot and sweaty, and where actually an electric bike, you find you can cycle a lot further without that cost of, well, actually, I've now turned up at work and I need a shower and I'm a bit uncomfortable. And electric bikes take that away, and they're a very small battery in the grand scheme of things. Yes, if you're happy to do it without a battery, great. But for those of us who might go, you know what, I probably wouldn't cycle any real distance without some kind of support. Electric bikes are a really good developing area.
I understand that in sort of advanced cycling countries like Denmark and the Netherlands, they basically, people are just living further away from their place of work and cycling further, commuting further on their electric bikes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even here, we're not very good with cycling as commuting, but even as a kind of cycling as a leisure, kind of exercise thing, because majority of supposed to be pedal assist, it is still exercise. Even just as a kind of leisure exercise activity, they still kind of fulfill that, even though the bit when you get to the hill, you don't have to go, oh my God, why did I ever do this? So, so yeah, so it's but yes, there are other ways other than just going, hey, let me grab the car. I shouldn't say it because I work in the automotive industry. Is the greener option? Any more?
Can I jump in? I'm trying to work out how to put my hand up and failing miserably.
Go for it.
Thanks. I wondered, Damien, if you could say something. Obviously, I think we've noticed on the news today or whatever about Volvo going all electric by 2030. Ford, at least in Europe, have already announced the same thing. Even McLaren. I mean, what's going to become of racing? Although Formula E might get better. But yeah, so the shape of the market over the next few years as manufacturers increasingly drop out of petrol cars.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly coming. I mean, obviously there's a legislative impact in terms of the banning in a number of markets of either pure internal combustion engines or of hybrids. Obviously, the UK position is there's going to be there's pure internal combustion and there's a 5-year grace period for hybrid vehicles with a significant electric only range, which would suggest it's plugins. So the market is definitely moving. I mean, Volkswagen for various reasons are making significant strides. So are Renault. They've made some big product announcements in terms of saying the stuff they've got coming, both in terms of cars and commercial vehicles, in terms of going electric. So it's definitely I think we will see more manufacturers commit to, certainly in Europe, commit to electrification. Now, as soon as that always comes with a question around infrastructure. That electric vehicles are pretty easy if you are a person with a house and a drive, and you can plug your car in at home. That's very convenient and very easy to work with. It gets less convenient, obviously, if you live in a development, where there's non-allocated parking or the shared spelling. Now, it's not to say it can't be done, through rapid charging and public charging. As people would say, look, people drive cars today and nobody has a petrol pump in the front garden. They don't worry about it. Now, they don't worry about it particularly because refueling takes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes. Batteries are getting faster to recharge. There's a place in Essex near Braintree where there's the largest electric forecourt in the UK is now opened, where I think they can charge something like 36 electric vehicles at the same time. And it's a bit of a thing where you stop, you put your vehicle on charge, you go into Costa, other coffee shops are available, have a coffee, go into Smith's, buy some wildly overpriced magazines. 20-30 minutes have gone, you go back, your vehicle's 80% charged, which is typically what you're going to get on a rapid. Rapids are designed to charge up to 80% for a variety of reasons to do with battery chemistry. And then you're good to go. So you've now you've gained 150 miles worth of range, off you go. So yes, it's not quite as quick as sticking 50 quid worth of fuel, into it, but it's not far off. By the time if you'd filled your car up with petrol, mooched around the shop a bit, bought a Twix's, tried to figure out what was actually in the 3 for 2 offer on chocolate, wrestled with the Costa Express machine, you might have spent 20 minutes at a petrol station anyway. So that's the way it will go for people who don't have. Now, that's where we get into this fuel cell conversation. There are other people who say, actually, for for either longer range or for convenience, is where fuel cell vehicles might have an edge if they can mass market them. But currently, battery electrics are where everyone sees the action being, at least in the midterm.
Great, thank you. Dick, you've got your hand up, it looks like.
I wonder if I could pose a slightly longer term question.
Try.
In about the next 5 to 8 years, it does seem as though many cars will be self-finding and autonomous driving.
Okay.
Couple that with the fact that all cars, whether they're electric, diesel, battery assisted or whatever, spend about 95 or 96% of their time parked and not earning their keep. The idea comes up of transport as a service, not as something you own.
Yes.
So there have been posited the idea of car clumps, call them what you like, big garages of cars, perhaps a couple in Hertford at north and south, and a dial-up service. Very easy on a mobile phone. The car slides in front of you, you having previously given the route, not the route, sorry, the destination, you hop in, and as soon as your belt is tightened, it glides off, presumably electric. Now that is a very different pattern, would involve a hugely reduced stock of cars working that much harder. Can you see that happening?
Well, now, there are some challenges. The first of which is autonomous driving is a bit like, is one of those things that's always 5 years away and has been for some time. And there are significant issues unresolved in terms of delivering that in everyday driving. But it might come, you know, that's fine. But in essence, I have to say, what you've described is a taxi. You know, if you think about it, a taxi is transportation as a service. So people could choose today not to have a car and to take a taxi. Now, if you're Uber and you can make it sound much sexier because it's a self-driving, autonomous, shared space vehicle, it's still a taxi. You know, at the end of the day, it's just a robo-taxi. Now, and so yes, some people will engage with that. There's a lot of money gone into it. Uber being one organization that, you know, they saw that as a real win for them. If they could operate their business, they have this fantastic app, customers bought into it. If they could just get rid of the drivers, you know, they would have nailed it. A couple of $1 billion later, they've sold their autonomous vehicle division to somebody else because they can't make it work. Now it is not impossible. It will come, but it's a lot of people have spent a lot of money to find out it's harder than they thought it was going to be. It's the answer. So now, yes, and then you get into the issue of this shared thing. Now the other argument, the other thing people posit is the idea that you do have a car, but you put it into that pool. So you say, well, okay, I have my electric vehicle, and yes, it sits outside my house because, or when I'm in the office working, assuming people ever do that again, it could do something else during the day. But then the question is this: do you really want to get in that car that somebody else has been in? Perhaps been smoking, you know, they're not supposed to, but, you know, there's no one in the car to tell them not to smoke, you know, maybe some sensor, that people may have left rubber, you know, there's a whole kind of space. There's a thing about, there's an obvious economics of, you know, it's just the vehicle, but there's also the personal dynamics of, it's my own space, I have control of it, the hygiene, everything else about it. That's quite different between a shared vehicle, be it your own vehicle you're sharing or use of a shared vehicle. And this is one of the things, you know, I always kind of, some people say, oh, we can do fantastic self-driving vehicles. I say, okay, but when somebody throws up in the back of it, who cleans it up? Because there's no driver. There's just this, you know, this is, mobile, I mean, you know, I've thought about it as an amount. I expect there'll be a kind of tiering of services that you know, if you pay the kind of premium price, there'll be you know, you can guarantee it. So if you want to say commuting times, they'll be much more in demand than they will be at other times of the day. So you pay a premium. Newer vehicles, you know, that you'll get at the time you want. It'll be a new, clean, nice vehicle would be one end of the scale. And then other people might well be going, well, actually, I'm on the kind of bargain basement version where it's a 7-year-old electric thing. It might have a few fag packets and the seats might be plastic. There might be a thing where you have to watch adverts to make the car go. There are all kinds of, there are a whole issues that start to develop into this. But yes, it's mobility as a service as opposed to owning a car has lots of potential, but some of that potential won't be tapped into because of the psychology of humans and the way we tend to want to do things. And I do have to say, what's the difference between a driverless taxi and a robo-taxi other than the fact there's no driver? Now, I've met some taxi drivers where getting rid of them would be an improvement, but equally, sometimes it's nice to have someone to talk to. I'm
Thank you
not sure
very
this answers your
much.
question,
Yeah.
but it's a topic I espouse about too much sometimes.
There's a weight, sort of pregnant weight, perhaps, for the suitable business model, but that is the big question, I feel.
Yeah.
Yes, you're quite right.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. David, you've got your hand up.
Sorry, have we got time for one more question?
One more question, and I'd like if we could wrap it up after that. I'd be grateful.
Okay. So the one thing we've not talked about at all, Damien, is pollution overall. I mean, the focus has been on carbon primarily, I guess, around climate change. But, the point that Dick raised around changing our lifestyle has got to be important, because we can't just keep consuming cars one after another. And the pollution generated in the mining and the manufacture, we don't take into account at all, as far as I can see. So, I mean, I class where we're going overall in terms of an emergency is not just climate, it is pollution in general, of which one is carbon, nitrogen oxides, carbon dioxide, etc. But all the rest, the plastics that are washing away as we're making these things, the metals and the pollution, the cyanides that are being washed away, the same in the manufacture of some of these metal ions, is just disastrous. Sorry, that was...
Well, I'll take that as an observation, if I may, rather
Yeah, no,
than
it's
a
just
question.
an observation, yeah.
And yes, it's certainly true. But I think this is, a classic. You have to start from where you are, and where we are is, I dial back, the global light vehicle market is 100 million units a year, which is an enormous amount of consumption. I don't argue with you about that, but you can't. But there isn't a just turning that off switch. That there's a how you transition that. That's for much smarter people than me to work out. But yes, that there are strategies that reduce the amount of new going into it would be good. And that's why I do like to promote people who are doing things like the DIY electric conversion type initiatives, where you take a vehicle that really is possibly reaching the end of its life, and convert into an electric vehicle that gives it a whole new lease of life, and without creating a wholly new thing, you've effectively created a clean new electric vehicle. And in fact, it's one of the areas where I think it'd be really interesting if there was some legislation to encourage that as an endeavor, to say, well, actually, we could take vehicles that are of an age, say, Euro 5 diesel things, which are currently very frowned upon, and actually convert them to electricity. If people could convert those, that would be a way to reduce the cost of making electric vehicles more available. And unfortunately, COVID has done quite a lot of damage to people's faith in mass transit, as Americans would call it, public transportation. One of the boons in the automotive industry in the last year has been people who have come off of buses and trains and want to buy a car because they don't want to be in a shared space. Now that'll wind back over time, but it is it's going to be an interesting period to push that back. But that conversion and incentivizing conversion, allowing people to reclassify vehicles, I think that's an area that's underexplored in terms of legislation to encourage and incentivize it. Cool. Right, good people. I hope you all found that interesting. I didn't bore you and talk too much. I apologize if I did.
That was really interesting. Thank you, Damien. And you went into a huge amount of detail as well, which is far greater than I was expecting. So it was really helpful. Thank you. Answered questions I didn't even know I had until you, until you presented on them. So that's brilliant.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Cool. And that's fine. And I said, if some future point we want to have a fuel cell conversation, we can circle back to that as a thing in itself at a future point, if people would like.
Brilliant, thank you. And thank you everyone for kind of being involved and for asking questions. And yeah, we can aim to get the slides put up as well. So you'll hopefully be able to access those as well.
Okay.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Great. Thank you all. Bye, everyone.
Many thanks. Many thanks. Great stuff.
It was a pleasure. Stop staring at this point. Lovely. Thank you very much, people. I'm off to say goodnight to my daughter. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye now. Bye now.